In a quiet little neighborhood where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and every house had a fresh coat of paint, lived John and Sarah Miller. From the outside, they seemed like any other couple trying to blend into their surroundings. John worked from home as a software engineer, spending his days typing away on his computer while sipping coffee. Sarah, on the other hand, spent her time tending to their garden, baking cookies for neighbors, and occasionally volunteering at the local library. To everyone around them, they were just another pair of homeowners trying to keep up with the strict rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA. But what no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that beneath Sarah's calm exterior lay a past filled with danger, intrigue, and skills honed through years of intense training. Long before she became Mrs. Miller, Sarah had been one of the most skilled operatives in the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. She'd traveled to some of the world's most dangerous places, completed missions that would make even seasoned soldiers shiver, and earned a reputation as someone who could handle herself in any situation. Her combat clearance was among the highest levels in the agency, meaning she'd faced threats that most people only saw in movies. When Sarah decided to leave the CIA, it wasn't because she wanted to escape her abilities or erase her past. It was because she wanted something different. She wanted peace. After years of living on edge, constantly looking over her shoulder, and never knowing when danger might strike, she craved stability. So she met John, fell in love, got married, and moved into this sleepy suburban community. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she could breathe easy. No more late-night calls pulling her into high-stakes operations. No more disguises or aliases. Just a simple, predictable life. The neighborhood itself was exactly the kind of place Sarah thought she needed after leaving her old life behind. It was quiet, orderly, and full of friendly faces. People waved hello when they passed each other on the street. Kids played basketball in driveways, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to live there. There was just one catch: the HOA. The Homeowners Association ruled the community with an iron fist, enforcing dozens of rules designed to maintain perfection. Lawns had to be mowed weekly. Cars couldn't be parked on the street overnight. Even holiday decorations required pre-approval. At first Sarah found these regulations annoying but harmless. Over time, however, she began to notice how seriously people took them, and how aggressive the HOA enforcers could be when those rules were broken. John, being the easygoing guy he was, didn't mind following the HOA guidelines. He figured it was part of living in such a nice area, and went out of his way to comply. Sarah, too, tried to adapt. She kept their yard immaculate, made sure their trash cans were always tucked away neatly, and avoided anything that might draw attention. Still, there was something about the HOA's behavior that rubbed her the wrong way. Their constant patrols, clipboard-toting inspectors, and stern warnings reminded her of the oppressive system she'd encountered during her CIA days. While others might have shrugged it off, Sarah couldn't help but feel uneasy. Something about the whole setup felt off. Despite her growing discomfort, Sarah did her best to stay under the radar. She attended HOA meetings when required, nodded politely at the patrol officers who drove by, and generally kept to herself. But deep down, she knew she wasn't like the other residents. Beneath her cheerful smile and friendly demeanor was a woman trained to survive in the toughest environments imaginable. If push came to shove, Sarah was more than capable of handling whatever challenges came her way. Unfortunately, neither she nor anyone else realized just how soon that skill set would be put to the test. Little did Sarah know, her quiet existence was about to be disrupted in the most unexpected way. What started as a minor disagreement over a piece of furniture would soon spiral into a confrontation that would reveal her true identity and leave the entire neighborhood talking. For now, though, everything appeared normal. The sun shone brightly overhead, birds chirped in the trees, and life in the Millers' household carried on as usual. Yet lurking beneath the surface was a storm waiting to break, one that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her new life. As Sarah watered her plants that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Maybe it was intuition born from years of experience in unpredictable situations. Or maybe it was just the weight of living a double life finally catching up to her. Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. Things were about to, get interesting. And Sarah Miller, former CIA agent turned suburban homemaker, was ready, for better or worse. The HOA in the Millers' neighborhood wasn't just a group of neighbors trying to keep things tidy. It was an institution. Every resident knew that the rules weren't suggestions. They were commandments carved into stone tablets, enforced with military precision. The HOA's patrol officers, Mike and Greg, were the self-appointed guardians of this suburban utopia. Armed with clipboards, walkie-talkies, and an unshakable sense of authority, they roamed the streets like soldiers, on patrol, ready to pounce on anyone daring enough to break the sacred code. Mike and Greg prided themselves on their work. They saw themselves as protectors of the community's standards, ensuring that every blade of grass was cut to regulation height and every car parked in its rightful place. To them, enforcing the HOA's rules wasn't just a job, it was a calling. They loved the power it gave them, the ability to make people squirm under their stern gazes. Over time, they had become more than just enforcers. They were feared figures in the neighborhood. Residents avoided eye contact when they saw the patrol car rolling by, hoping not to draw attention to themselves. On this particular evening, Mike and Greg were making their usual rounds when something caught their eye. A small wooden bench sitting near the edge of the Millers' driveway. It wasn't much to look at, a simple, weathered piece of furniture probably used for sitting outside on sunny afternoons. But according to the HOA rulebook, front yard furniture was strictly prohibited. In their minds, this was a clear violation, a direct challenge to the order they worked so hard to maintain. Excited by the prospect of catching someone in the act, Mike and Greg pulled their patrol car to the curb and stepped out. They exchanged confident smirks, already imagining how they would handle the situation. "This is going to be easy," Mike said, adjusting his belt. "Let's teach these people a lesson about following the rules." What neither of them realized was that they were walking into territory far beyond their understanding. While they prepared to confront Sarah Miller over a trivial matter, they had no idea who or what they were dealing with. Their arrogance blinded them to the fact that this seemingly ordinary woman was anything but. As they approached the house, Mike and Greg grew bolder. They knocked loudly on the door, their posture rigid and authoritative. When Sarah opened it moments later, they didn't hesitate. Without waiting for her to speak, they launched into their rehearsed routine, accusing her of deliberately defying the HOA's regulations. Their voices were loud and condescending, dripping with disdain for anyone who dared step out of line. But there was something unusual about Sarah's reaction, or lack thereof. Instead of cowering or apologizing like most residents did, she stood calmly, her expression unreadable. Her silence unnerved them, but they pressed on, determined to assert their dominance. That's when things took a turn neither of them expected. Greg reached for his taser, holding it up as if to intimidate. "You need to take this seriously," he snapped, his voice rising. Mike followed suit, pulling out his pepper spray. Both men thought showing force would scare Sarah into compliance. After all, it had worked countless times before. What they failed to understand was that Sarah wasn't your average homeowner. She wasn't intimidated by weapons, or by bullies, pretending to have power. Sarah's mind raced as she assessed the situation. Years of training kicked in automatically, allowing her to remain calm despite the escalating tension. She recognized the signs: aggressive body language, raised voices, and now the introduction of non-lethal weapons. To anyone else, this might have seemed excessive, even absurd. But to Sarah, it was eerily familiar. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate her with threats, real or imagined. The difference here was that Mike and Greg were playing a game they didn't fully understand. "Put your weapons down," Sarah said firmly, her voice steady and commanding. There was no trace of fear in her tone, only resolve. For a moment, the two men froze, caught off guard by her composure. Most people would have panicked or backed down immediately, but Sarah wasn't budging. If anything, she seemed to grow more confident as the seconds ticked by. Mike recovered first, his bravado masking his unease. "We're not messing around here," he barked, stepping closer. "You're violating the rules, and we're authorized to enforce them." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her patience wearing thin. "Authorized," she repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "By whom? And why are you pointing weapons at me over a bench?" Her question hung in the air, exposing the absurdity of the situation. Yet instead of backing off, Mike and Greg doubled down, their frustration mounting. They shouted louder, their movements becoming more erratic. To them, Sarah's refusal to submit was infuriating. They were used to being obeyed without question, and her defiance threw them off balance. Unbeknownst to them, however, Sarah was calculating every move they made. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands gripped their weapons too tightly. These were amateurs, acting tough but lacking control. In another life, she might have laughed at their antics. But this wasn't a joke. It was a test of wills, and Sarah wasn't about to lose. As the confrontation continued, Sarah's instincts told her to de-escalate. She wanted to avoid physical conflict, especially since this whole ordeal stemmed from such a minor issue. But Mike and Greg weren't giving her much choice. Their aggression was building, and she knew she couldn't afford to wait and see what they'd do next. With lightning speed, Sarah acted. Before either man could react, she disarmed Greg, twisting his wrist until the taser clattered to the ground. Startled, he stumbled backward, his confidence shattered. Meanwhile, Mike fumbled with his pepper spray, but Sarah was faster. She grabbed his arm, applying pressure to a nerve point that left him immobilized without causing lasting harm. The entire sequence unfolded in mere seconds, leaving both men stunned and terrified. What are you doing?" Mike stammered, his voice trembling. He looked at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, realizing that she was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Sarah stepped back, keeping them in her sights. "I'm protecting myself," she replied coolly. "Something you should have considered before pulling weapons on me." For Mike and Greg, the realization hit hard. They weren't dealing with a typical suburban wife. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and who wouldn't hesitate to defend herself if pushed too far. Their bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by sheer panic. As they stood there, humbled and defeated, Sarah made it clear that this incident wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment Sarah disarmed Greg and neutralized Mike, time seemed to freeze. Both men stood there, wide-eyed and trembling, their earlier bravado completely shattered. The taser lay on the ground at Sarah's feet, a silent testament to how quickly the situation had spiraled out of their control. For Mike and Greg, this wasn't just an embarrassing defeat, it was a wake-up call they hadn't seen coming. They were used to intimidating people into submission, relying on their uniforms and weapons to command respect. But now, faced with someone who wasn't afraid to fight back, they realized just how fragile their authority really was. Sarah didn't waste any time gloating or rubbing their failure in their faces. Instead, she maintained her calm demeanor, speaking in a firm but measured tone. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't about a bench. This is about accountability. You two came here acting like you have the right to threaten me over something so trivial. Do you even understand what you've done?" Her words hit them like a punch to the gut. Mike stammered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. We didn't mean," he started, but Sarah cut him off before he could finish. "You pointed weapons at me," she reminded him, her gaze unwavering. "You accused me of breaking rules without giving me a chance to explain myself, and for what? A piece of furniture that doesn't hurt anyone? Does that sound reasonable to you?" Greg, still clutching his wrist where Sarah had twisted it moments earlier, nodded frantically. "We're sorry," he blurted out, his voice shaking. "We didn't know it would go this far. We'll leave, okay? Just please don't call the police." Sarah raised an eyebrow at that. "Call the police?" she echoed, almost amused by the irony. Here were two men who carried tasers and pepper spray, pretending to enforce laws they didn't fully understand. now begging her not to involve actual law enforcement. It was almost laughable if the situation hadn't been so serious. Before she could respond further, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A car pulled up and John stepped out, looking bewildered. He had returned home from work early, expecting a quiet evening with his wife. Instead, he walked straight into chaos. His eyes darted between Sarah, who stood calmly despite the scene unfolding around her, and the two HOA officers, who looked like deer caught in headlights. "What's going on here?" John asked, his voice filled with confusion and concern. He glanced at the taser on the ground, then at Mike and Greg, whose expressions ranged from fear to shame. Finally, his gaze settled on Sarah. "Are you okay?" Sarah nodded, her expression softening slightly as she turned to her husband. "I'm fine," she assured him. These two gentlemen decided to escalate a minor issue into something much bigger than it needed to be. John frowned, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "Escalate how?" he asked, glancing back at the officers. "Why are they carrying weapons? Isn't that against the law?" Mike and Greg exchanged nervous looks, realizing they were in deeper trouble than they'd anticipated. "It's not illegal," Mike mumbled defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're authorized by the HOA board to carry non-lethal tools for protection." "Protection?" John repeated incredulously. "From what? Angry garden? Gnomes?" Sarah couldn't help but smirk at her husband's sarcasm, but she quickly refocused. "John, let's not get sidetracked," she said, gesturing toward the two men. "The bigger question is why they felt the need to pull weapons on me over a bench. That kind of behavior isn't just unprofessional. It's dangerous." John crossed his arms, studying the officers with growing skepticism. "Okay, so explain yourselves," he demanded, turning his attention to Mike and Greg. "What exactly happened here?" Mike hesitated, clearly unsure where to begin. "We were doing our job," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We saw the bench in the front yard and thought it violated the HOA rules. We came to address it, but things got out of hand." "Out of hand?" John echoed, raising an eyebrow. "That's putting it mildly. Did you really think pointing weapons at my wife was appropriate?" Greg chimed in, desperate to salvage some semblance of dignity. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone," he insisted. "We just wanted her to take us seriously. People usually comply when we show authority." Sarah snorted softly at that. "Authority?" she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "You don't earn authority by scaring people into submission. Real authority comes from earning trust and respect, not waving weapons around like cowboys in a bad movie." Her comment struck a nerve with both men, forcing them to confront the reality of their actions. They had spent so long believing they were untouchable, enforcing rules with an iron fist that they never stopped to consider the consequences of their behavior. Now standing face to face with someone who refused to back down, they were forced to reckon with the fact that their methods weren't just ineffective, they were reckless. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Mike and Greg started apologizing, profusely, promising to drop the matter entirely. "Please, Mrs. Miller," Mike pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "We made a mistake. We'll leave right now and forget this ever happened. Just don't report us, okay?" Sarah studied them carefully, weighing her options. Part of her wanted to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, to make sure they understood the gravity of their actions. But another part of her recognized that punishing them might only perpetuate the cycle of fear and aggression. She didn't want to become the same kind of bully they had been. Instead, she chose a different approach. "I won't report you," she said finally, her tone firm but fair. "But I expect answers. Who gave you permission to carry weapons? And why do you feel the need to enforce these rules with such hostility?" The two men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the question. After a long pause, Greg spoke up. "The HOA board encouraged us to be stricter," he admitted reluctantly. "They said residents were getting too relaxed about the rules, and they wanted us to send a message. We thought carrying tasers and pepper spray would help us maintain control." Sarah's jaw tightened at that revelation. It wasn't just Mike and Greg acting recklessly. It was the entire system. they represented. The HOA board had created a culture of intimidation, empowering its enforcers to act like vigilantes rather than community leaders. This wasn't just a problem with two overzealous patrol officers. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. "Fine," Sarah said after a moment, her voice steady. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave now, and we're going to pretend this never happened, for now. But I'm calling a meeting with the HOA board tomorrow morning. If you have any sense of self-preservation, you'll encourage them to cooperate fully, because if they don't..." She let the threat hang in the air, leaving no room for doubt about her intentions. Mike and Greg nodded vigorously, eager to escape the situation. Without another word, they scrambled to their patrol car and sped away, leaving Sarah and John alone in the driveway. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, John turned to his wife, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "Okay," he said slowly, shaking his head. "I know I married an amazing woman, but remind me again why I should never get on your bad side?" Sarah chuckled softly, the tension finally easing from her shoulders. "Let's just say I've had practice handling situations like this," she replied cryptically, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "But honestly, John, this isn't over. Someone needs to hold the HOA accountable for this kind of behavior. And if no one else is willing to step up, then I guess it's up to me." John smiled, admiration shining in his eyes. "Well, whatever you decide to do, I've got your back," he said firmly. "Just promise me one thing. You'll let me handle the cookies next time we host a neighborhood meeting." Sarah laughed, the sound light and genuine. For the first time since the confrontation began, she felt a sense of relief. The immediate danger had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. Tomorrow she would face the HOA board and demand answers and justice for what had happened tonight. And if there was one thing Sarah Miller excelled at, it was fighting for what was right. As they headed inside, closing the door behind them, Sarah knew that life in their quiet suburban neighborhood would never be the same again. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the HOA board meeting with a quiet determination that turned heads. She wasn't there to make friends or win popularity contests. She was there to expose the flaws in a system that had spiraled out of control. Armed with evidence from the previous night's confrontation, including photos of the disarmed officers and recorded apologies captured on her phone, Sarah walked into the room ready to hold the board accountable for their reckless behavior. The meeting was held in the community center's main hall, a large space usually reserved for holiday parties and bake sales. Today, however, it felt tense and formal, like a courtroom awaiting its verdict. The HOA board members sat around a long table, looking uncomfortable but trying to project authority. They were used to giving orders, not answering questions, and Sarah's presence immediately disrupted their usual dynamic. As she took her seat across from them, John stood quietly by her side, offering silent support. His presence gave her strength, but Sarah didn't need much encouragement. She'd spent years navigating high-pressure situations where stakes were life and death. Compared to those experiences, facing down a group of suburban bureaucrats felt almost easy. "Thank you all for agreeing to meet with me," Sarah began, her voice calm but firm. "I assume you've heard about what happened last night involving your patrol officers, Mike and Greg." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of the incident but unsure how to respond. One of them, a middle-aged man named Richard, who seemed to fancy himself the leader of the group, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Yes, Mrs. Miller," he said cautiously. "We understand there was an altercation, but we believe this can be resolved without further escalation. Perhaps a simple apology is in order?" Sarah raised an eyebrow at that, her expression unreadable. "An apology?" she repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Do you really think an apology fixes everything? Let me remind you what actually happened. Two men approached my home, drew weapons on me, and accused me of violating a rule over something as trivial as a bench. Does that sound like something that deserves just an apology?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for Sarah's directness. Well, yes, it was unfortunate, he admitted reluctantly. But I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. Our officers are trained to enforce the rules, and sometimes tensions run high. Tensions run high? Sarah interrupted, her tone sharpening. That's not an excuse for pointing tasers and pepper spray at someone. Do you even realize how dangerous that is? What if I hadn't been able to defend myself? What if this had happened to someone else? A child? An elderly person, or someone unfamiliar with self-defense? Would you still call it a misunderstanding then? Her words silenced the room. No one dared to speak as Sarah continued, her voice growing more intense with each sentence. This isn't just about me or my bench, it's about accountability. You've created a culture where people feel empowered to act aggressively under the guise of enforcing rules. That's not leadership. It's abuse of power. One of the other board members, a woman named Linda, tried to interject, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Miller, please understand, we're just trying to maintain standards in the neighborhood. We want this to be a safe and beautiful place for everyone to live. And I agree with that goal, Sarah replied, softening, her tone slightly. But safety doesn't come from fear. It comes from trust and respect. Right now, your methods are doing the opposite. People don't feel protected. They feel threatened. And that's unacceptable. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but Sarah wasn't finished yet. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder containing copies of the photos and recordings she'd gathered the night before. Sliding it across the table, she said, "Take a look at this. These documents show exactly what happened when Mike and Greg came to my house. They also include statements from both officers admitting that they acted recklessly and that they were encouraged to do so by higher-ups within the HOA. The board members hesitated before opening the folder, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock as they flipped through the contents. Richard's face turned red while another member, a younger man named Tom, looked visibly shaken. Clearly, none of them had expected Sarah to come prepared with such damning evidence. This changes things," Richard stammered, fumbling for words. "We had no idea our officers would behave this way. We'll launch an internal investigation immediately and ensure stricter oversight moving forward." Sarah nodded slowly, satisfied that they were finally taking her concerns seriously. "Good," she said. "But I want more than promises. I want action. First, I expect Mike and Greg to resign, or at the very least undergo mandatory training in conflict resolution and de-escalation. Second, I want a review of all policies related to enforcement, including the use of non-lethal weapons. Third, I want transparency. Residents deserve to know why decisions are made and how rules are enforced." The board members exchanged nervous looks, clearly overwhelmed by her demands. For a moment, Sarah wondered if they would push back or try to negotiate. But then Linda spoke up, her voice steadier this time. "We'll comply with your request, Mrs. Miller. You're right. We've let things get out of hand and we need to fix that. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Sarah allowed herself a small smile, knowing she'd won this round. But she wasn't naive enough to think the battle was over. Changing a deeply ingrained culture wouldn't happen overnight, and she knew she'd have to stay vigilant to ensure real progress was made. As the meeting concluded, Sarah turned to leave, John following close behind. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, casting golden light over the neatly manicured lawns. It was hard to believe that just hours earlier, this peaceful neighborhood had been the site of such tension and conflict. "You handled that beautifully," John said proudly as they walked back to their car. "Seriously, I don't think I've ever seen anyone take down a group of bureaucrats like that." Sarah chuckled softly, appreciating his praise. "It's not about taking them down," she corrected him. "It's about making them see the bigger picture. They may not like it, but change only happens when people are willing to stand up and demand better." John nodded thoughtfully, gazing at her with admiration. "Well, whatever happens next, I'm glad you're on our side," he said with a grin. "Just promise me you won't start wearing a cape anytime soon, okay?" Sarah laughed, the sound light and genuine. As they drove home, she reflected on the day's events. Yes, the HOA Board had agreed to her terms, and yes, Mike and Greg would likely face consequences for their actions. But more importantly, she'd planted a seed of change, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary things could happen when someone refused to settle for less than justice. For now, life in the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Neighbors began questioning the HOA's authority, demanding clearer explanations for their decisions. Slowly but surely, the culture of fear started to fade, replaced by a sense of empowerment and unity. And as for Sarah, she continued living, her quiet suburban life, tending to her garden, baking cookies, and volunteering at the library. But every once in a while, when someone mentioned the HOA or praised her for standing up to them, she couldn't help but smile. Because deep down, she knew one thing for certain: sometimes the most unlikely heroes live right next door. In the days following the HOA board meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and speculation. Word of Sarah's confrontation with Mike and Greg, and her subsequent showdown with the HOA board, spread like wildfire. At first, people were hesitant to talk openly about it, unsure whether they should admire Sarah's boldness or fear retaliation from the HOA. But as details emerged, opinions began to shift. Slowly but surely, residents started seeing Sarah not just as a neighbor, but as someone who had stood up for them all. For years, many in the community had quietly resented the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. They'd complained behind closed doors about the endless rules and the aggressive patrols, but no one had dared to challenge the system directly. After all, what could an ordinary homeowner do against an organization that seemed to hold all the power? Sarah's actions proved that change was possible if you were brave enough to fight for it. At first, Sarah didn't realize the impact she'd made. She went about her daily routine, tending to her garden, chatting with neighbors during evening walks, and helping John fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. But soon, she noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now stopped to thank her. Some even invited her over for coffee or asked for advice on dealing with the HOA. It was strange, yet oddly heartwarming, to see herself become a source of inspiration for others. One afternoon, as Sarah watered her plants, a young mother named Emily approached her driveway. Emily lived a few houses down and often waved hello when passing by, but they hadn't spoken much beyond pleasantries. Today, however, Emily looked nervous, clutching her hands tightly as she hesitated near the gate. "Hi, Mrs. Miller," Emily said softly, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Can I talk to you for a minute?" Sarah smiled warmly, setting down the watering can. "Of course, Emily, come on in." Emily stepped closer, still looking uneasy. "I heard about what happened with the HOA," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I just wanted to say, thank you. What you did, it gave me hope." Sarah tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "Hope for what?" she asked gently. "For standing up to them," Emily replied, her tone growing stronger. "You don't know how long I've been frustrated with their rules. Last month, they fined me because my son left his bike on the sidewalk for 5 minutes while he ran inside to grab something. 5 minutes. And when I tried to explain, they acted like I was making excuses. It felt so unfair, but I didn't know what to do. Seeing you stand your ground, it showed me that maybe we don't have to take it anymore." Sarah listened intently, nodding along. "You're right," she said firmly. "We shouldn't have to live in fear of being punished for every little thing. The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not control it. If enough of us speak up, we can make real changes." Emily's eyes lit up at that. "Do you think we could organize something like a petition or a meeting where everyone shares their concerns?" Sarah smiled, pleased by the suggestion. "Absolutely. Why don't we start small? Invite a few trusted neighbors over for coffee tomorrow morning. We'll brainstorm ideas and figure out the best way to move forward." By the end of the week, Sarah's living room was filled with neighbors eager to discuss reforming the HOA. Some came with stories of unfair fines or intimidating encounters with patrol officers, Others simply wanted to support the cause. Together, they drafted a list of demands: clearer guidelines for enforcement, transparency in decision-making, and stricter oversight of patrol officers. They also decided to host a public forum, inviting all residents to voice their concerns directly to the HOA board. The forum took place on a Saturday afternoon in the community center. Dozens of people attended, packing the hall to capacity. For the first time in years, residents spoke openly about their frustrations, sharing experiences that painted a troubling picture of life under the HOA's rule. One man recounted how he'd been threatened with legal action for painting his mailbox a shade of blue deemed non-compliant. A teenage girl described being scolded by an officer for skateboarding in her own driveway. Each story added fuel to the growing movement, galvanizing the crowd into action. Throughout the event, Sarah remained a calming presence, guiding discussions and ensuring everyone had a chance to speak. When Richard, the same board member who had initially dismissed her concerns, tried to defend the HOA's policies, the audience erupted in boos and jeers. Clearly rattled, Richard promised to address their grievances, though his promises rang hollow to those who had endured years of neglect. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, several neighbors approached Sarah to express their gratitude. "You're amazing," one woman said, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never thought we could stand up to them, but you showed us it's possible." Sarah accepted the praise graciously, though she knew the fight wasn't over. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and there would undoubtedly be resistance from within the HOA. But for the first time in a long time, the community felt united, a powerful force working toward a common goal. That evening, as Sarah sat on her porch with John, she reflected on everything that had transpired. "It's funny," she mused, sipping a cup of tea. "I moved here, hoping for a quiet life, but instead I ended up starting a revolution." John chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Well, revolutions need leaders," he said with a grin, "and I can't think of anyone better suited for the job." Sarah smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Though she'd left her old life behind, she realized that the skills and values she'd developed as a CIA operative still served her well. Whether navigating dangerous missions overseas or challenging corrupt systems in suburbia, her ability to assess situations, strategize effectively, and inspire others remained unchanged. As twilight descended, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She may have traded espionage for gardening, but her mission remained the same: to protect and empower those around her. And if that meant taking on the HOA or anyone else who threatened the peace and safety of her community, then so be it. Life in the Millers' household returned to its usual rhythm, but with one key difference. Sarah was no longer content to blend into the background. She embraced her role as a quiet protector, using her experience and determination to create positive change. In doing so, she reminded everyone, including herself, that heroism isn't defined by capes or badges. Sometimes it's simply about standing up for what's right, even when faced with absurdity.